Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, podcast listeners. Welcome back to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Apologies for getting this episode out a little bit late. Just been crazy weather, as we will soon talk about backing up field work and some of those things. But we are here today to give you a weather update with Dr. Aaron Wilson, and we have a lot to talk about, as you can imagine. Aaron, since you're a frequent guest, I think most of our listeners know you, but just go ahead and introduce yourself again for those who may be new.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here again. Aaron Wilson, field specialist in weather and climate, ag weather and climate with Ohio State University Extension, and the state climatologist here in the state of Ohio.
You know, we always talk about how crazy the weather's been every time you're on, but this spring is no exception. I don't know that I've ever seen anything quite like what we've been through.
So we're actually here at a meeting with a lot of our colleagues, and that's been the discussion. I was telling someone yesterday the amount of water that we saw over Memorial Day weekend. I have never seen that much water in my life, I don't think. We had the freeze early on. It's just been one thing after another.
Well, and even looking back to April in Southern Ohio, we were complaining about how dry it was before monsoon season hit. And even looking between North and South, they're so delayed planting in Northwest Ohio again because of the rain that it's like we're living on different planets.
Yeah, certainly it is. And I think depending on where you're in the state, like you're very different conditions depending on what month we were in their spring. You know, one of the things that we had talked about on our last podcast is that, you know, we needed some water to get rid of the drought conditions in Northern Ohio. They had been in D3 over quite a bit of area there for quite a while, over 200 days. And you know, we talked about there was an opportunity. We looked like precipitation was leaning wetter than average for spring, and we needed that to overcome the drought conditions. But a lot of us got a lot more rainfall than what we anticipated, for sure. But we certainly were able to get rid of the drought as well. So that's good. And we officially brought it into La Nina as well, which we thought would happen, although things taking place in the tropical Pacific right now are rapidly changing toward a warm scenario. So we'll talk a little bit about that today as well.
I think with the lagging growth heat units we've had this spring, I don't think a lot of us are going to be sad about some increases in temperatures.
Yeah, that's it can be a little bit tricky about the summertime when it comes to El Nino. Maybe we'll talk about that in our outlook a little bit. You know, we started pretty rapidly with growing degree day accumulation. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we look back overall, temperatures for our spring, which we defined meteorologically, you know, we just turned June 1st, which was the start of the meteorological or climatological summer, but March, April, May, temperatures were about 1 to 3 degrees above normal. Now that may feel weird because we're coming off a very cold month, which was May, where we were 1 to 3 degrees below normal, but we had our warmest April, going back to 1895 for Ohio, our 7th warmest March, and it was the warmest start to spring on a March-April basis. So we did have early season growing degree days, which are great for our, you know, horticulture friends and specialty crops and flowering trees and things. But we have not, again, with the cooler May, had those growing degree day heating units for our agronomic crops out there just yet.
Yeah, the freeze event that we saw at the beginning of May was kind of interesting because, like, just from my apple trees in my yard, like they were past flowering at that point. So typically you think late freezes are going to be a detriment to some of our horticultural crops. But it was almost like we were so early with our growing season to start that we missed maybe some of that damage.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting.
But then we did see it in our soybeans. So that was unfortunate.
And wheat as well.
Yeah,
and I think
that's true. Yeah, down your way.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was so interesting about it is in a normal year, a first weekend in May freeze wouldn't be a big deal because we are only, a week or so into planting across most of the state. Mm-hmm. We had folks in Ohio this year, in Southern Ohio, that were finished planting in April, which is crazy to think about. And so the fact that we had so many crops that were planted early that were already up made us more susceptible than normal to that. What was a slightly late freeze, but not a wildly late freeze. It was still above our typical cutoff.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, in Southern Ohio, that May 3rd freeze is about maybe once or twice every 10 years. So it's pretty rare for Southern Ohio. I mean, our typical last freeze is right around April 20th in Southern and Central Ohio. Northeast Ohio, it's common to see it into the early part of May, but even there, we had a freeze on May 12th up in Trumbull County and Geauga County. So that's even late for them. So, yeah, for us, it really pushed it toward that 1 to 3 chance out of 10 years of seeing those freeze conditions. And it came at a time where a lot of that soybean, right, was just out of the ground enough to really, take that damage.
I know we had some that already had trifoliates, and then as we talked about, we were ahead of schedule on wheat. We had a lot of wheat that had hit anthesis in the week leading up. So quite possibly worst case scenario for timing on a cold freeze for that wheat crop.
So you talked about precipitation getting some of us out of the drought scenario, but we also had some record setters.
Yeah.
So catch us up on what's going on with precipitation across the state.
Yeah, so it was a very yo-yo season, like in a yo-yo north-south, north, or south-north-south, basically is what happened. So we started the spring off very wet in March, especially along and south of I-70. We had a couple of events there that were 3-inch events, so 4 to 10 inches of rain fell across much of central Miami Valley, so southwest Ohio, across central Ohio. So it was the 13th wettest March on record. And then really that wetness shifted very quickly to the north. So April was very wet across northern Ohio. So 4 to 10 inches up there. So 32nd wettest, and it was a little bit lower or a little bit drier because it, as Elizabeth mentioned, it really dried out in the south, where a lot of folks saw 50 to 75% of normal rainfall in April, which was pretty good for planting, right? And being able to get the stuff out in terms of not having the conditions, too soggy in the fields. But then May came along and we had widespread 4 inches across almost the entire state, which is a little bit above normal, but we were looking at 8 to 12 inches of rain in southwest Ohio. So Dayton picked up 10.31 inches. That's the wettest May on record for the Dayton area. And it's the 4th wettest month all time out of
Wow.
all months over the last 132 years. And so that is quite the record in terms of that amount of rainfall. In central Ohio, Columbus is similar, very wet, wettest May. And we'll see, our final spring statistics officially will come out next week. But right now it's looking like, a statewide precipitation average this spring was 15.65 inches. That's more than 4 inches above normal, and unofficially the 4th wettest spring, and the wettest since 2011. 2011
Don't
was
bring that one up.
yeah, 2011 was our wettest year on record for Ohio. So, we've got some pockets of southern Ohio that picked up 20 to 25 inches of rain just during the spring. But interestingly, there's some pockets in there like Fayette County, southern Madison, Fayette, a little bit of eastern Clinton County that did not pick up quite as much. And it seems like there's some locality, maybe like the sweet spot in southern Ohio from a rainfall perspective. But yeah, very wet spring, wettest since 2011. We've ended the drought after 239 days in northwest Ohio. And if you go farther northwest, parts of Williams and Fulton County, very rapidly drying out here during the month of May. And we've already got a lot of flash drought concerns, so very rapid onset drought concerns across Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and parts of Indiana. And I think that extends into northwest Ohio as well. That, believe it or not, after the very wet spring, we saw last year how quick we went from a wet spring to, then having the driest August on record. We've got to keep an eye on that as we head through the summer. But certainly as we projected to get a little bit wetter than average this spring, we certainly probably overdid that just a little bit in the rainfall.
Well, there's been another factor that we don't talk about a lot that's kind of balanced the amount of rainfall, and that's the wind.
Yeah.
I don't know how many conversations I've had in the last few months about how it's just so much more windy than typical. And even you and I have had some conversations about, you keep mentioning how much evapotranspiration has been happening, and it being July, August levels back in March and April. So do you want to talk a little bit about that trend for us?
Yeah, so this spring, certainly, when we don't have a very robust long-term climatology of wind across the entire area, but we can look at individual stations. We could also look at wind speeds in different buckets like 0 to 10 miles per hour, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. All four of those categories that I mentioned, places like Dayton, Columbus, Cincinnati, other parts of Ohio, Defiance, Lima, those were all in record territory in terms of what we've experienced at some of those individual stations. Just the amount of hourly observations above those thresholds or within those buckets. As you mentioned, that very warm April came with very windy conditions, and we were seeing, between 2/10 and a quarter of an inch evaporation rates per day, which is something we often see in July. We don't necessarily see that in April. So with all that rain that fell in central and southern Ohio in March, the wind and the warm temperatures that came in April, you didn't really see it. There were crops dusted in, right? You could see the dust flying as crops were being planted in April. So yeah, it was kind of interesting. And I think too that, that evaporation and that soil moisture loss, maybe, had we had a really wet April as well, we would have had a lot more extensive flooding than even we had. Now we had plenty of flooding with those really heavy downpours, but even some of the big events, it fell over 4 or 5 days where we had 5, 6, 7 inches in 5 days. And so some of that drying actually probably saved us from wetter conditions or soggy soil conditions as we head into June now. So pretty interesting stuff. I mean, to get a quarter of an inch evaporation rates in April, you got to do some work. We had some highs in the 80s and wind speeds at 20, 25, 30 miles per hour that can really lead to those high evaporation rates.
Yeah. I know a lot of people are frustrated about not being able to spray, but to your point, it was, I think, a blessing in disguise. When we think about it, it was just a week or so ago that we were having these rainfalls and we were already back in the field within a few days. When we get to this critical June timeframe where we're trying to get stuff done, it's kind of nice to have the wind and the evaporation on our side.
Yeah. And the difference between northern and southern Ohio is pretty stark, right? Because southern Ohio was wet, then warm and dry, then wet and cool. Northern Ohio, it was dry March, wet April, and then wet-ish and cool in May. So that's, leading to some of these sort of planting date issues that folks are experiencing here across northern Ohio.
I think the weather always has impacts, but when we think about farming in Ohio and managing, I think we should just talk about that for a little bit. What does this actually mean when we're receiving so much rain all at once, but then we have these rapid drying conditions as well? I think we have a lot of hybrid development available, and our crops have adapted to be able to handle wet and dry conditions. I don't know, Elizabeth, what you think about helping farmers continue to adapt to these types of situations.
Ooh, that's a tough question to ask. Agronomically, in a lot of ways, it's out of our control. Mm-hmm. And we saw some scenarios where we were really looking at worst case scenarios. We had, again, crops that were in very susceptible stages because of the warm temperatures we had in that early window. When things cooled off and got wet, we were sitting with wet and cool, which when we talk about seedling health is honestly worst case scenario. I think the other thing, again, the agronomics are a little out of our control. The main thing I think that farmers are going to deal with now is logistics. I know at home we had both the side dresser and the planter out yesterday because we've got crops that were planted a month ago and crops that are going in the ground today. And we're going to see that throughout the summer, that gap in maturities when we're applying fungicide, when we're doing our weed control windows, that's just going to be almost 2 seasons in one that we're dealing with logistically.
You mentioned side dressing, and I think there's some nitrogen out there that likely got washed away. And so we've talked for years about split applications, not putting all your nitrogen on up front. And the feasibility of that, of course, depends on the equipment that you have, but we continue to improve our technology. We've done a lot of work with irrigation, the smaller systems that are available, and trying to find out, how much nutrient can they deliver during the growing season beyond the time frame that we're able to get into the field with traditional equipment. So I think that farmers do need to think really hard about, if you're struggling each year, are there investments? No one wants to hear that right now because there's not a lot of extra money out there. But, starting now, are there small investments or changes that you can make to help address some of these issues?
I mean, traditionally tiling has been the way to
Right.
go
Yeah.
right to be able to get that water off. But when then you need it with these
Right.
rapid oscillations, how are we looking at things, water retention and water reuse and those sorts of things that can be costly and really expensive
Oh,
to
yeah.
put some controlled drainage structures in, but are obviously part of a tool belt of resilience. So, it's interesting. I think these big events like the May drive folks to think, well, I've got to get more tiling, which can be the case, but what happens then if we end up drying out pretty rapidly? Is there opportunities there that are feasible, that are even feasible in today's,
Yeah.
environment?
And I guess I'd throw out there challenging farmers to think more cooperatively as well. Our drainage specialist, Vinayak, he has been looking a lot at water retention and being able to reuse that. And it is just so expensive. But is there a way we can achieve some of that in a smaller community type scenario rather than just literally watching it all wash away, drain away, which is what we want to happen at that point in time. But then when we need it during pollination, it would be nice to have.
And this was a tricky year. I think every podcast we've said, like, you'll get your window, take advantage of it.
Yeah.
And this year, at least in Southern Ohio, it was a little bit hard to watch when that window came. I know several guys started in March. Again, some people finished planting in April, and then we get cold, wet conditions that persist. And the amount of replant that had to happen was really all over the board in my neck of the woods. So apologies for telling you guys to take your windows when we get them. It's a little out of
Well,
our control.
yeah.
And again, we haven't gotten them until now, the
Yeah,
first
Northern
week of June
Ohio
again.
finally has their window here at the beginning of June before they could really, open up with this nice weather and Omega block and all that stuff that's been happening.
And we always rib you, Aaron, but if you could give us a little more heads up. He did. And in Aaron's defense, he was trying to give us a heads up on that potential cold snap that first week of May. And I kept telling him, like, we can't tell guys to park the planter now. We've been telling them to take their windows when they get them. But I do think that those cool conditions were a little worse than we thought they were going to be and persisted a little bit longer.
I think it's also an opportunity to have a discussion with your seed dealer and really, what is on that seed coating? If you're not in a situation that needs that insecticide, can we make sure we're getting the fungicides on there that we need? Because that seems to be the issue that we run into more commonly in Ohio, is protecting those young seedlings from those wet diseases, more so than insect damage early on.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, to your point. I know we had a long stretch where we were talking about a lot of those seed treatments were going to run out before we got the heat units to get those crops up. And this was just a really interesting year where I think going into the freeze, we were concerned about the most advanced crops, but it really turned out those weathered the storm pretty well. And it was the ones that were planted really within the last week or 10 days of that cold freeze that took the hardest hit from what I've seen.
Yeah.
So what you're saying by interesting is that the new E-Fields 10th anniversary in January, when it drops, will have some interesting results in there.
Of the trials that survived the cold, yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about what's going on now. What are we expecting to see over the next couple weeks too?
Yeah. So, we've alluded to it a little bit after the heavy rainfall in the third week of May, wettest May week on record for a lot of us. Weather really opened up, mild temperatures and dry weather. So really a beautiful week. We're sitting and recording here on the 3rd. We haven't really had a lot of the summer humidity. You think the mugginess and really oppressive stuff. We've had a lot of highs now in the 70s and lows in the 50s. Part of that's thanks to this Omega block that's been, a weather pattern that looks like the shape of Omega. And so that pattern has really benefited us because we've been on a cooler side of it, kind of mild, dry side of it, while they've baked already in near 100 degrees in the Dakotas, for instance, this week. And we haven't really felt a lot of that humidity, but patterns are changing. So, we that's shifting toward the east. We're heading into a pattern here this first week of June where a lot more southerly flow coming up. And so what we're looking at now as we head through the next couple of weeks here in June is that more summertime like pattern. We'll start to feel the Gulf moisture coming up out of the south, some scattered thunderstorms day to day, more of those isolated heavy rainfall events, I think. Um, Especially across southern Ohio, maybe a little bit drier right now. Our early signals for June are a little bit drier than normal, maybe across northern Ohio. So that area of Williams, Fulton, Lucas, Ottawa counties, those could start to flirt with some drought conditions up there. We alluded to this earlier with El Nino. So, the tropical Pacific is in a neutral phase, but we are rapidly warming in the tropical Pacific, those sea surface temperatures. And I know everybody's heard about super El Nino, so we can sort of talk about that now as we think about how it might impact our upcoming season. Well, first I would encourage everybody to check out Chris Farley on YouTube. I am El Nino. So
I
just
think
to
you've
get
mentioned
prep-
that before.
I have. 1997,
That plugin.
98, we blamed everything on El Nino. So, I know right now everybody's talking about that. I'd like to pause folks a little bit to say El Nino does not have a big impact on our summer.
Mm.
It takes some time once that tropical Pacific warms up to change the weather patterns farther downstream. And so it always has a bigger impact once we get into late summer, certainly in the fall, and then the winter time is its big player there. But yeah, I was giving you a little opportunity to say, what is super El Nino, right? So
Right.
yeah. So it's not something we use really scientifically. We have we have weak events, strong events, very strong events. 97 was a strong event, very strong event. 2023 and 24 was a very strong event, and 24 was the warmest year on record globally. But it can have different impacts in for us. So it
So
doesn't
it's
have
not it's not super common, but in recent history it seems like it. I mean, 23, 24, and now 26.
Right. And before that it would have been 2015, 2016. And not every El Nino or La Nina actually couples what we say couples to the atmosphere. The weather pattern doesn't always behave the way we expect it. And we haven't
You don't
observed.
say.
Right. So especially as overall sea surface temperatures have warmed, and the Pacific is really warm this year. So we're pretty confident that it's going to be a warm year to 2 years here in terms of global temperature. But it doesn't have a big influence on our summertime. There's some little correlation with maybe slightly cooler than average temperatures across the Great Lakes that can nose down into Ohio. And then late season, it's got very low confidence in this, that we tend to be a little bit drier during El Nino summers when they're forming earlier, which it's doing. So that late season dry is also a trend that we've seen, right? Where we've seen our Julys, Augusts, Septembers trend drier here over the last 70 years. And then we kind of get wetter as we go forward from there. So right now, we could lean near to below average temperatures. I think that's what we're looking at. And there could be a drying trend later in the growing season, but confidence is pretty low in that connection for summer.
It's hard to say what's actually going to happen. One thing that we always worry about when we have a really wet start is root development. And we've seen in years where that corn in particular doesn't put roots as deep. So on the flip side, we had our huge rain event over Memorial Weekend. We haven't had any rain since. You kind of want that root to develop a little bit, but you also have challenges when it turns dry right away.
Perfectly timed rains would be awesome.
During pollination?
Yeah.
I never ask for
an
that.
inch or so a week would be awesome.
The averages tell you get an inch a week on average,
Yeah,
right?
on
But
average,
it all comes
right.
down in a single storm. And
Like, not afraid of it being dry right now, but of course we don't want the drought to start now.
correct. Yeah. And we've got some buffer. I mean,
Yeah.
even up north where I was talking about, Williams and Fulton County, it's dry in the last 30 days, but all our time scales, 60 day, 90 day, 120 day, it's pretty wet. There's some deeper soil moisture there. And we can see that in our mesonet stations now there across the Northwest and South now too. Jackson and Piketon are running pretty dry because of that April dryness, but everything's recovered. So there's moisture there. We've got a flash drought risk farther west. It could extend into northern Ohio, but right now we're buffered by that just a little bit. I would expect, right now based on our projections for the summer, that it's a pretty good pollination and grain fill period here. We'll have to watch for soybeans as we get into August. Do we see that late season dryness kind of kick back in again, like last year? Hopefully, nothing like last year. But certainly right now it looks like the growing season looks pretty favorable if we can get planting
Yeah,
completed,
right.
which is for Northern Ohio folks, certainly that's something that we're watching, and then we'll watch for that late season drought onset. So could still be some challenges. Likely there will be challenges. One good thing about El Niños is they tend to limit tropical activity. So at least from that perspective, we can never forecast how many will hit the coast. But from a positive, at least the risk is lower for tropical activity. Although sometimes we need those late season rains to get up here to finish some things off.
Well, I appreciate the optimism. Anyways,
I always try.
doesn't sound too
I try.
bad.
Yeah, I mean, we've always got to take our licks with these things, but hopefully folks can get done, get completed, get the next necessary logistics completed, and have a good season.
Do we have a forest fire outlook? I mean, that's impacted our radiation in the past.
Yeah, that's a excellent point, actually. The trends are toward more fire right now. There's some early El Ninos are usually pretty good for Southern California and across the southern tier states. The Pacific Northwest tends to dry out, so I would be a little bit concerned about the Pacific Northwest and the Canadian prairies again.
Yeah.
Then it becomes a matter of wind flow. Are we in that northwest wind flow? And that all depends on where the high pressure is located. If it's located in around Arkansas, South Central, then we get a lot of northwest flow, and we tend to get a lot of storms, but also bad air quality from those wildfires. If it tends to be a Bermuda high, which is the pattern we're going into this week, we get southerly flow, and we keep that wildfire smoke away. So it'll be a week-to-week basis, a 7 to 10 day pattern, depending on where their high pressure is. But the risk is higher, elevated over parts of the West that have been fairly dry and didn't get a lot of snowfall either during the summer or during their winter. Thank you. Yeah, during their winter time. And so that means that they're kind of lacking water resources in a lot of the West right now. So we'll be watching it. It's a great, excellent question. Actually.
Well, I think we've kept you long enough, kept our listeners long enough. We appreciate it. Aaron, any resources you want to share?
Yeah, you can always check out the State Climate Office of Ohio, climate.osu.edu. We give monthly and quarterly updates to these conditions that can arrive via email, so you can sign up there at climate.osu.edu. You can also get to the new stations, the Ohio Mesonet stations, through our website as well. And you could always reach out, wilson.1010@osu.edu. I love talking about the weather, so just reach out anytime for any questions you might have.
All right, thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.